The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Does It Satisfy? A conversation between Matt Dillahunty and Shane Rogerson. During the month of March, I spent most of that time touring Australia with Seth Andrews and Aaron Ra, and just before our Melbourne event for the Unholy Trinity Down Under tour, I sat down on behalf of the City Bible Forum of Melbourne to have a conversation with Shane Rogerson. The event was billed as one individual used to be an atheist and is now a Christian, and the other one's a Christian who used to be an atheist. A more accurate billing would be that both of us were born. At some point, he became convinced of some atheist and Marxist philosophical positions. I did not. At some point, we both became Christians. And at some point, I found out that I didn't have good reasons to believe what I believed about Christianity, and I left it. And he has not yet. Shane was a great guy. This was a nice, friendly conversation. We had lunch afterwards. There's many things that we're going to disagree on, but it was a good conversation and friendly. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from this. I wanted to go ahead and post the video in its entirety. It's about 45 minutes long, and let you kind of decide how it went, what you thought about it. And in upcoming videos, we'll be taking a look and a listen to some conversations with street preachers in Australia, which was also an interesting experience. So now, the discussion, does it satisfy?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the City Bible Forum. My name is Robert Martin. I'm the director of the City Bible Forum in Melbourne. And welcome to our event here today, Does It Satisfy? Now, at the City Bible Forum, we ask the bigger questions, and we aim to do this with rigour and respect. The famous Greek philosopher Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." We think that by listening respectfully to the views of those who hold opposing positions, we can all examine our assumptions about our beliefs and ultimately determine what is true. Now, we hope that you will leave today challenged in some way by today's conversation. Now, I'll introduce our guests in a second, but then we'll begin our discussion. But I really want our conversation today to be satisfactory. To that end, we really want to focus on the issues related to the topic advertised. And to make this satisfactory to you, we want to ensure that your questions are answered. You can participate in the conversation by sending questions via text message to the number provided. Looks like one's just come through. I'll try to incorporate your questions into the discussion, but there's likely to be more questions than time, but I'll try my best, and so please text away. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest today, who's Matt Dillahunty. Matt was raised in a loving Southern Baptist home and was a fundamentalist Christian for over 20 years. He set out to reaffirm his faith with the intention of attending seminary and becoming a pastor. Yet his faith was destroyed and he became an atheist. He's a popular speaker, debater, and the host of the TV show, The Atheist Experience. We're delighted that he can join us here today. Please welcome Matt Dillahunty. Our other guest today is Shane Rogerson. Shane grew up in an atheistic home and was once a Marxist, but he was converted to Christianity, studied theology, and has worked for a number of years in churches in coastal New South Wales, inner city Sydney, and has been the lead pastor of St Matthew's Anglican Church in Prahran for the last 4 years. Please welcome Shane Rogerson. Now, the Rolling Stones famously sang "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," a song written expressing dissatisfaction with commercialism, the consumer culture, and sexual frustration. But what about a meaningful philosophy and outlook on life? Can we get satisfaction? Well, that's the topic of today's discussion. Does it satisfy? Which experience of life is most satisfying, atheism or Christianity? We're going to hear the stories of Matt and Shane, who both have experienced life as committed atheists and also committed Christians. So let's hear their questions. Let's hear their stories. Question and think, and we can work out which most experience of life is most satisfying. So maybe we'll start with you, Matt. I'll join us here. I'll try not to be too obtrusive in this conversation. Share your story. What convinced you to change your mind?
Yeah, so I'd spent most of my life in a Southern Baptist church, surrounded by people who had the same beliefs that I did. And they were convinced, and I was convinced, that God wanted me to be a preacher. It turns out that pretty much every person in my youth group was convinced that God wanted me, or wanted them to be a preacher. It's everybody gets, many of them get this kind of call to the ministry or the idea. And some of them do. I was absolutely terrified of public speaking, which is particularly ironic now as it's all I do, with whether I'm performing magic or giving a talk or teaching a class at university. I was also had a girlfriend at the time, wanted to get married, had no job prospects, didn't want to work fast food forever. I'd been a board student, barely scraping by to pass because it was trivial and they didn't challenge us at all. So I joined the Navy in order to kind of run away from what I thought God wanted me to do and give me a chance at a decent life and marriage. I spent 8 years in the U.S. military, and I was a believer the entire time, but I wasn't particularly active during that time. It didn't matter that much to me. It was more of a time of let's meet other people, explore the world, do my job, make some money, and work towards a different life. I ended up in the tech industry in computer software in Austin, Texas. And when I lost my job because I'd worked so well, basically is what happened. I worked myself right out of a job, and that was very frustrating because I'm self-taught, I don't have a degree. And I worked and worked and worked, figuring that if you work hard, you're going to get something out of it. And what you get is fired in some cases. And I was pretty disillusioned, and I said, okay, this is punishment. This is God telling me that I should have done what he wanted me to do, and I didn't, and so I've lost this tech job. So now I give up. If this is what you want me to do, I'll do it. I spent about 1.5 years in pretty serious prayer and study, worked with some ministers and some family members who were missionaries. At the time, my roommate was an atheist, and we had agreed not to talk about it. I believed, he didn't. We were best friends, love him like a brother. So let's not have that conversation. But I was terrified of getting to heaven and having God say, why is this man who you love like a brother burning in hell? Why didn't you do your job? Why didn't you follow my instructions under 1 Peter 3:15 and tell him so that he might be here with you? So I set out to figure out how to convince him, and that backfired spectacularly.
So tell me what happened with it, with the backfire.
It's not that there was any one thing. It was, I've read the Bible many times. I've read it as a teenager. I read it again during this process. And I started coming across arguments from secularists that were criticisms of the Bible, criticisms of belief. And I started learning more about epistemology, about how do we go about having sound reasons for things. I'd always been a skeptic, but I hadn't applied it to my religious beliefs. And when I did, it just started falling away. It wasn't like there was one moment where I went, aha, this is garbage. That's not even the case. I have no good reason to believe. There's a lot of people who look at atheists as atheists are, there are no gods, rah, 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 and you can't convince me. And really, it's the example I've given is kind of a courtroom type thing where the prosecution is accusing God of existing, and I don't think they've made a compelling case, so I'm going to vote not guilty until I have some better evidence.
Correct. So and then where did you end up after that? Because
so once I realized that I had no good reason, I started talking to more people, and I wanted, much like a new born-again Christian, I wanted to share this with people, but it felt strange to go knocking on doors, and so I started writing online. There were a couple of independent news magazines that I wrote for, and on one of them was a guy who went by a pseudonym of Skip Tumalu, and he would pick out a particular passage in the Bible and he'd write a sermon. He was a Christian of some stripe, and I thought, well, I grew up with a slightly different version of Christianity from him, and I have a different view of it now. So why don't I take that, come on in, why don't I take that same passage and show how it could be viewed or interpreted in a different way? And so we had this back and forth there. I ended up working with the atheist community of Austin. I was first told about the TV show, and I said, why would I want to watch that? Why would I want to watch a show with people who agree with me? I want to get involved with people who don't agree. But I found out that that's what the show was all about. It's a live call-in show. I started doing that. I've been doing it 10 years this month, hosting the Atheist Experience. And it's I don't know, it's changed my life.
Well, over to you then, Shane. Let's share your story. And is your story kind of in many ways is the opposite to Matt. Do you want to share where you started and where you ended up?
Oh yeah, well, I'm not sure it's the opposite. I think everyone's story in the room is probably unique in some way, but there's not sort of, I don't think there's patterns of stories, but I was born at the end of the Vietnam War to a single mum, never knew my dad. I grew up in a working class family where there was no belief in God. I would say to people that the faith of my childhood was that of faithlessness. Never went to Sunday school or went to church or had any talk or belief about God. There was no Bibles in my home or anything like that. So my first contact with Christianity came in my high school years, and I didn't really understand what these people were about. I didn't see why belief in God was necessary for being a human being or a person. But they were very good looking, and I wanted to go out with one of them. And so I did start exploring Christianity to some degree. But my worldview, the assumption of my world was always a naturalistic universe that was fundamentally, there is stuff, it was materialistic. My parents expressed that in what you'd probably call Epicureanism. Eat, drink, be merry tomorrow. There's lots of always good wine and cheese in my family, and that was I suppose it was a socially respectable hedonism is kind of what we had. But I entered into the worldview of these people I respected because they were lovely people. I cared about them, they cared about me. And so I tried to understand their worldview, being Christianity. So I tried to understand something of the logic and the coherence and why they thought I needed to live as a Christian. They were obviously evangelizing me, and they weren't flirting to convert, which I would have been very happy with. And so having entered into the Christian worldview and tried to understand it, I came to a point where they saw that there was an ultimate ground of reality that was supernatural, to them revealed in Jesus, the man from Nazareth, who they thought was a saviour, and one that had a divine mandate to rule my life. And I just said, no thank you. I didn't want anyone ruling me. I think I was pretty honest with them about that. I kind of liked being in charge of my own destiny and controlling my own life. And so, but I sort of opened up a Pandora's box because I started asking questions of, well, what is logical and coherent and livable? And I was already in this sort of naturalistic and materialist framework, and I'd rejected Christianity, and so that led me into a path of trying to understand a worldview that I could really live in and give myself to, which sort of led me into I suppose what you'd call a classic Marxist worldview, which, if you understand, I'm not an expert in Marxism, nor am I an expert as a philosopher or a debater or...
Yeah, you're a room full of no experts.
Yeah. But one of the things about the socialist worldview is that it comes out of an atheistic standpoint, and it tries to understand, it gives life an overarching meta-narrative or meaning, and it was one that I thought I could give myself to, and so I did. So that's kind of
so that was where you were. Then what changed, and what convinced you?
I maintained friendship with my Christian friends. They were very... they put up with my obstreperousness. I used to go along to their university Christian groups and listen to the talks and then deconstruct them afterwards. I was never very good at doing it, but I was successful enough at doing it that, they had me on prayer lists and all those kind of things that they do. And I was a threat, and some people saying, you know, don't hang out with Shane at the bar because he might convince you of other things. But the truth was, the only person I ever convinced at the bar as an atheist was another atheist when he said, what is this Christian worldview? And I explained what I thought was the logic and coherence within the Christian worldview. And we went on a semester break, and I came back the next year and he converted to Christianity. So anyone who knows me in Christian circles knows I'm not a very gifted evangelist. And I would have to say I was most successful as an evangelist when I was an atheist. So,
Has that ever happened to you, man?
On occasions. And actually, I've said that, you know, if somebody comes out of a conversation with me or after watching a show and they'll say, oh, my faith is now strengthened. Well, it's a little disappointing, but I'm at least glad that they were willing to participate in the conversation to some extent.
Like what we're doing here today. Yeah, that's right. So
I don't think either of us is likely to change our minds today, but it's worth having a thought.
So we're going out for a drink afterwards, so maybe we could do it there.
What happened was a guy took the time to enter into my own worldview that I was becoming more and more convinced of. And I liked his daughter, so we had one thing in common. He was a scientist. His name is Douglas Orr. He's a very big man. He must be, I don't know, 21 stone, 6'5", 6'6". And we were discussing, you know, my naturalistic, materialist worldview, my commitment to a socialist framework. He wanted to unpack that with me, and so we stood on a beach. It was a beautiful night. The stars were out, the moon was there, all that kind of stuff. And there was great beauty and poignancy in this moment. And he basically posited towards me the possibility of the fact that within my worldview there was only one thing that we both wanted, and that was his daughter. And he was bigger than me, and he was thinking about strangling me to death with his bare hands on the spot. And how would I feel about that? And he then unpacked that for me and created somewhat of an existential crisis for me, which was, I suppose the question was, what is your life worth? Because if at that moment he did crush me with his bare hands, which I think he was powerful enough to do, and he had a big gun rack at home, and I believed if his hands couldn't do it, his guns could. And he said, you know, we just leave your body right here on the beach, it'll decompose, the moisture will go out of it, we'll be left with a pile of dust and chemicals, and I could sweep that out and take that and get it processed, or just simply put it on my rose garden. And what's your life worth? To me, a $5 bag of blood and bone for my garden. And I objected at that point. I said, well, you just can't do that. That would be unfair, that would be unjust. Obviously, I was working within a humanistic and egalitarian framework, and he kind of questioned, well, what right do you have to call that right or wrong, good or evil, which is one of the questions probably comes up a lot with you. And so that then forced me to think, well, what is my life worth? And is this just some big cosmic accident where DNA neither knows nor cares? We begin in nothing, we end in nothing, there's chaos in between, survival of the fittest or the fattest. And we're both going to win. And so that raised those questions.
Yeah. So what was in the end that you decided to change your mind? Well, just very quick, what was the?
I came to a point where I saw that the possibility, the fluke of life, without something outside of what we know as the universe, bringing it into being, intelligently bringing it together, to me seemed far less probable. Having a chaotic, non-created universe seemed far less probable to me than a created one. And also, in trying to come to grips with morality, within a socialist framework, we were seeing the unpacking of nearly 100 years of socialism at this point, and where it had got people in terms of morality and power. And that itself led me, you know, I think the year that I was considering these things, that in the Soviet Union, I think in 1 year in the Soviet Union, 4.5 million people were born and 6.8 million babies were aborted. And I thought, how do you make those decisions? And that whole moral framework was where I came to a point where I actually think we do need a moral reference point outside of whoever's in power.
Maybe get your response in some respects. It's obviously Shane's story, but the challenge to the atheist that we are just DNA and time, and that's all we are. What are your thoughts there, man?
Yeah, there's like eight things within there to address. I mean, he had mentioned that Marxism comes out of atheism. I think that's false. Atheism has no tenets, no dogmas, no instruction. There's no way to get from I don't believe in God to therefore I must set up some sort of specific political, social structure. Now, the fact that they're compatible, that you can be a Marxist and not believe in God, but that's no more relevant than humanism. I mean, if you're going to say that Marxism can come out of atheism, which I think is false, you could also say humanism comes out of atheism, which is far better. This idea of kind of nihilistic doom that is kind of foisted on people, especially when it comes to discussions about morality, is one that I find particularly frustrating, because if I'm standing on the beach and somebody's threatening my life and saying, "What's your life worth?" Well, maybe it's not worth anything to you, but it's worth something to me, and I may not be able to stop you from killing me. I don't see any reason to think that there's anything after this life. Maybe there is, I don't know, I'll be dead. But you'll have to live with it. And when we talk about morality, I'm actually a proponent of a version of objective morality, that as physical beings in a physical universe, our actions have specific consequences that are dictated by the naturalistic, materialistic universe. If I hit you, it's going to do damage. If I cut you, it's going to do damage. And so even if we don't necessarily know what the right answers are, we know that there needs to be right answers, that there are right answers. So in any given situation, there is a finite set of actions you can take. Some are better, some are worse, which means there must necessarily be some set of one or more actions that represent the moral pinnacle for that situation. And that's what humanism would have the goal of looking for. Are we going to find all the right answers? Probably not. But this idea that a God somehow solves this problem makes no sense to me. If the only thing that's stopping someone from killing me is fear of what a God will do to them, I don't see that as any different from the only thing that's stopping them is fear of the punishment of the law. Neither of those have anything to do with morality, about what is right or wrong. They have to do with what kind of consequences are you going to face. And the example that I've often given is if you're out to dinner and somebody's got a couple of kids and they're misbehaving, and they take them home, and one of them is told, when we go out to dinner again, you're going to behave yourself, and if you do, you'll get dessert, and if you don't, we will beat you. And the other one is set aside and said, hey, the way you acted at dinner was very disruptive to other people. How would you feel if somebody was doing that to you? And you take them both back out to dinner, now they both behave. But what happens when you take the parents out of the equation? The one that was promised the reward, the carrot and the stick, is less likely to behave because he doesn't have a proper understanding of the consequences of his actions. And so I think we've been kind of misinforming people about what morality is, how we go about it, how we interact, by making the problem, I think, more difficult than it needs to be. It's really just a recognition that we have to share space, that we know, for example, the world is better when we tend to cooperate. It's better, slavery. The Bible explicitly sanctions slavery. It tells you who to enslave, how to enslave, blah, blah, blah. I don't know why. If it's inspired by God, that wasn't corrected. But setting that aside, we know slavery is wrong. We know that all we had to do was ever ask the slaves. I mean, they could have told you why it's wrong. But there's kind of two little things that kind of guided me on morality. One is the think globally, act locally. What would the entire world be like if everybody took the action that I was going to take? And that kind of raises your consciousness to realize the sort of actions you might take. And the other one is the veil of ignorance. Design the sort of society that you would want to live in, not knowing what your station is going to be within that society. Are you going to come in at a lower class or an upper class? Are there going to be classes in there? That sort of, where we're striving for equality, where people are treated fairly under the law. We know that these things get us a better society, and I don't see any need to kind of appeal to an external deity.
Can I ask at that point, you say we know justice is right, we know human dignity is right, we know this is wrong. The question is, how do you know you know?
How do you know you know?
Yeah.
Well, it may be that what we're talking about is a difference between what we're defining as right and wrong. Because to me, what I define morality as it relates to the well-being of thinking creatures. And so right and wrong are just labels for the things that benefit us versus the things that harm us. How do I...
Will that change?
Sure.
Yeah.
It may be the case that we as a species change dramatically such that some of the things that might actually be immoral in this situation aren't immoral in this. So for example, when Katrina, the hurricane, hit New Orleans and there were people stealing, they were still stealing. But the situation had changed where the most moral action was for them to take that bread to survive. Just as if somebody's having a heart attack and there's a defibrillator behind glass at a store, you break it and save their life. Whereas if you just broke it just to steal it, the motivations matter and the situations matter.
As I worked through this, I was thinking through how do we decide, because that sounds like situational ethics.
It is situational,
Yeah.
but within each situation there represents some absolute, some best group of actions.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things I struggled with is I thought about how do we determine in that particular situation the ethical outcome or outworking that is right for that moment. Who gets to determine that?
Each individual is, they're always going to make up your own mind. You need to be able to do so with recognition that it could be wrong. There may be a situation where I took an action that I thought was the best action, and then later I find out it really wasn't. And that's where we get into this kind of cooperative society where we're educating each other. Every situation is going to be a little different, but there are some situations that are going to be very similar to things that we've experienced, such that we can learn from the past. I mean, that's what we've always done. When we don't, I'm struggling to find a particularly good example that's not slavery, but we learned that society is not better if you have slavery. It's not better for the slaves or the slave owners.
Yeah.
But that was counterintuitive because it seems so much better for the slave owners at the time. And then we find out that that's actually not the case. We also find out that it's better if we allow everyone, women, to vote and to get educated. That we shouldn't divide society by those tiers. Whereas once upon a time, this kind of kingmaker mentality, it seemed like it was better for all of us if we just kept the women folk off to the side.
So that, as I thought about that, I was thinking, there's things that, so again, justice, equality, for example, and we say these things seem so right, they seem things we ought to pursue, so do away with slavery, bring in the women's vote, all those kind of things. But that oughtness, I suppose, to me it seemed arbitrary and socially constructed, unless we have some absolute to appeal to. And I don't think you have to believe in God to believe in justice, and I don't think you have to believe in God to believe in human equality. In fact, sometimes people who believe in God perpetrate injustice
Sure.
and but also people who don't.
But I'd say the absolute standard are the physical facts about reality.
Do you want to explain to me what do you mean by the physical facts about reality?
So it's not just arbitrary that chopping off your head does harm to you. There's nothing arbitrary about that. Chopping off your head will kill you. And that is directly in conflict with this idea of well-being and flourishing. And so on that simple one-on-one level, we've got that one down. So we can extrapolate from there. Because if we have a society that permits or encourages people to run around cutting off each other's heads, we have a society that is increasingly worse. Whereas if we have a society that discourages that, then we have a society that is better. And I really think that's all you need. I think in order to come up with kind of a moral view, you need a few basic assumptions. And you need to have the ability to change those assumptions if you find out that your base assumptions are wrong. But if you start with life is generally preferable to death, which I would hope everybody could agree on, as the descendants of the people who chose life, that health is generally preferable to sickness, that pleasure is generally preferable to pain. Not always. Sometimes there are conflicts between those. If you're in so much pain, death could become preferable to life, and that's where you get into the situational aspect of it. But if you start with that foundation, you can build it, and I think that's exactly what we've done. My view of, so first of all, I don't think that religions solve any of the problems that they're raising, because, we need some objective standard. Well, if I don't accept your objective standard, we still don't have one. And if there are 1,000 different religions that are all pointing to what they think are their objective standards and they disagree, that we haven't solved anything. It's just as subjective as anything they're going to object to.
There's a question in terms of within the different religious worldviews, which one is actually most livable. So, for example, part of my story was suffering. So, having raised some of these existential issues, I then had to enter into the different major religious worldviews and try and come to grips with how each of them dealt with something that we all face, because we all will die. I think we're all on the same page there. We all will suffer in some way, in some form. And so within those worldviews, they all had a view on the sanctity of human life, what is just, all those kind of things. But just because they have a view of life that had an absolute, within that there was I still want to say, well, this one's right and this one's wrong, or this one's more livable and this one's less livable. It seems to me that there is, when we talk about, we end up, when we talk about immorality, we end up making choices about what's going to be good for them. It becomes very utilitarian. Mm-hmm. And so you get to the point where in the USSR, in 1990, there's 6.8 million killing of life, something that we think is important, whilst only 4.5 million people are allowed to live. And so you start to say, well, how is that just? How is that fair? How is that? And to me, the sand starts to shift here, because in the end we're saying, well, in the end the majority rules on this one, and more of us think it's okay to kill that 6.8 million than for the 4.5 that live. Well, can you see that it becomes a very subjective measure, and in the end we're down to power, and who has the most power at this point?
I don't think it's a matter of power. And without digging in for a long time on the issue of abortion, which I think we were talking about.
Well, it's an example.
To me, so there's a perspective there, and I'm very much pro-choice, because I don't see how it's morally right to force someone to remain pregnant and bear a child to term. If a mother has a baby, you can't force her to give blood, you can't force her to give a kidney, you can't in any way use her body to support that life. And so consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Consent to pregnancy is not consent to remaining pregnant. And I don't see how it is morally right to force someone to remain pregnant. But even if we set aside the issue of morality, as a matter of law, I don't see how it could ever be legally right to force someone. You're basically saying you have to give your body up to something else.
You say it's not morally right to force something on someone, but it is morally right to take a thing that we value, which is life, and kill it. So how do you come to those? Is it just might is right?
So there's lots of questions coming in, and this probably relates to one question: is how do you get the objective foundation? I mean, you mentioned something before, but I suppose this kind of gets to the heart of the question: how do you actually get to the objective foundation of human morality?
It's a process of discovery. I mean, we're so good at it that it feels intuitive. Quite often, we just know X is wrong. But why do we know X is wrong? It's because we've had and experienced the problems. We've come to the understanding that slavery is wrong because we've lived through it and we've examined it. This is the whole point of the examined life.
Right.
That the fact that I'm appealing to reality as the objective standard doesn't mean that we currently know or have solved all moral issues, or that we ever will. But it is the best standard I can come up with, that at least we can agree on that. Whether or not we agree on whether there's a God outside of reality or as part of reality, I would hope that we can at least agree that we're sharing a reality. There are some who don't agree. I've had debates with them.
Solipsism.
Yeah, and the presuppositionalists who want to say that, oh, maybe you're a brain in a vat, or how do you know you're not a brain in a vat?
They watch too much Matrix.
Yeah.
We could keep talking about this for a while. I just want to be conscious of the time, of getting back to some of the questions of satisfaction and of meaning, perhaps, of what is the life that is most satisfying. Rick Warren claimed that without God, life has no purpose, and without purpose, life has no meaning. Without meaning, life has no significance or hope. Matt, what do you say about that?
So what he's using as a definition of purpose and meaning is, I would agree with him, because he's basically saying there's no externally imposed transcendent meaning or purpose, and I see no reason to think that there is, nor would I want there to be. I find it really curious. I speak to a lot of universities, and I always ask them, how many of you would like your parents to pick your major? How many of you would like the government to decide what your job's going to be? Wouldn't you rather steer your own ship than have it guided by somebody else? Now that what you want does not in any way impact what's real. This is where we get to the question of satisfying, which I'll probably touch on before we're done. So whether or not I want somebody to be in charge of my life is irrelevant. But it seems curious to me that people prefer this idea that there's a God who's got some plan, who is in charge of your life. I wouldn't even want that word to be true. But I also see no reason to think that it is true. And when I look at life, and people ask, well, you know, where's the meaning and purpose? I think in many ways people tell you you've got a God-shaped hole in your heart, and that God can fill it. You don't. There's a hole, and I mean, pump for pumping blood. But it's like saying, people will say that, some atheists will say, religions poison you and then offer you the cure. And I think that's wrong too. I think religions convince you that you're sick when you're not, and then offer you their homeopathic remedy. And that it's just all water. Because when I see meaning and purpose in life, it is meaning and purpose that we imbue life with. My life has whatever purpose I give it. Oprah once said she felt sorry for atheists because they couldn't experience awe and wonder and joy. And have you never met any of us? I mean, I have awe and wonder and joy every day. They made fun of me because as we went around, I kept taking pictures of trees. And it's not just when people call the show and say, how can you not believe in God? Look at the trees. I love trees. I love, nature. And I'm in awe of it. And my life has the meaning and purpose that I give it. And I share that with others.
What would you say to that, in that, I suppose the person would push back and say the reason you experience awe and beauty and love and relationship is because that's actually part of your hardwiring. It's the way you've been put together. Even if you don't recognise the God who gave you that hardwiring is there. How do you come back on that?
I'm fine with that. I mean, I think that we don't know enough about the brain. There are some things that are learned. There are probably some things that are wired a particular way that were based on our need to survive. Our penchant for recognizing faces where there really aren't faces comes from an evolutionary advantage, where if the bushes are rustling, the person who thinks he sees a face or a monster and takes off running is more likely to survive than the person who sticks his head in there and gets it.
Sure. But like, we talk about if we accept that in our hardwiring, whether it be naturalistic or creative, that we're hardwired for relationship and love, right? That love itself seems to be incredibly unnatural in the sense that love is, laying down oneself for another, which goes against survivalist instinct. What do you say to that?
No, that's not against survivalist instinct at all. So
people who sacrifice themselves in wars and throw themselves in front of trains for other people.
So there are people who sacrifice themselves, and so the way evolution selects for things, it doesn't really select for, it selects against, I would say. But the persons who went down to lay down their life to protect, for example, their children, have ensured the continuation of their gene, which is the primary motivator of evolution, is the progression of the genome. But also, we have evolved to be cultural, and there are individuals who, if they're willing to lay down their life for the group, encourage the spreading of their smaller groups' genes, even if they aren't individuals who have kids. But it could also be, somebody called the show once and said, if homosexual is natural and occurs in nature, why haven't they gone extinct? Because they're not going to be breeding. So first of all, they do, and especially when society forces them to hide who they really are and get married and have kids. But the other thing is that one of the things that we need to pass on the species are the kids. I'll try not to get overly lewd. We need genetic females who are really, really interested in having sex with men. And we need the opposite to be true. And because of that, it may be the case that this heightened sexuality extends such that occasionally you're going to have genetic males who are interested in having sex with genetic males. It's an offshoot of this. We don't really know. But there's nothing about it that is contrary to propagating our species. Laying down your life, because it's not about you, it's kind of about your genes, which are shared by family members and cultural groups.
So this is one of my struggles with it, because we talk about why love, why have relationship, why not just instead of finding a life partner or many life partners these days and giving ourselves in love to them, why not just spread our genes by raping the next person who walks along the street and then killing them because I'm stronger? And again, I come back to that. Why is that any less legitimate than one that?
Well, from the standpoint of nature, it's not. That happens. Ducks, as a matter of fact,
Dolphins. Yeah.
Ducks are famous for raping, and actually, what's happened is the female duck has a flap, and she can determine which male sperm actually gets to the egg, and the rest of them go off to a dead zone.
Yeah. But we're not ducks, are we?
No, but we're also not running around. See, we've each evolved to pass on our genes in a different way, and in our way, we've evolved to be social creatures, because there's something about the cooperation that benefits us. I mean, look what we've done from cooperation. We're sitting here recording stuff. It's going to be broadcast over the internet. I've flown halfway around, almost all the way, halfway around the world, whatever. Yeah. So it's not that nature has some intent, and this is the way we ended up because nature intended. We just ended up this way. And when we're talking about what's moral, we're talking about what's in our best interest, what encourages our well-being.
So when a theist, because I became a deist before I became a Christian. So there was a progress there. But this is the other point that actually led me, I suppose, into theism, which was that human beings seem very different from all the other evolving species.
Yeah.
How do you come back at that?
Every species would be able to say that.
But they don't.
But they could. My species is different from all the other species. Anyone could say that.
Give me one paper that a dolphin has written.
Well, see, you're picking. Give me, point to a human that can run as fast as a cheetah.
Sure.
I mean, the cheetah gets, man, look at those slow players. So we arrogantly.
But that's the point, isn't it? Because I don't think that cheetahs actually do. That's isn't it? I think isn't it?
That's the point. Is that cheetahs have no self-awareness of the fact that they're amazingly fast.
I don't know that. I think the cheetahs know they're fast. How could you not know you're fast? So what you're doing is you're taking the particular trait that allows us self-reflection, this consciousness, and saying, this puts us so much, so far ahead and so superior to all these other creatures. And I agree with respect to that one thing. And you could pick that for any measure. It's remarkable, but it's nothing that I don't see that it requires any sort of external, divine guidance.
See, I find that extraordinary, that the development of human beings, our consciousness, the way we love, we relate, we cooperate as social beings.
They love, they cooperate.
To the extent and the complexity that human beings do, it seems an amazingly evolutionary fluke.
Well, it's just we're better at it. In the context of the things that we're good at, we're better at it. You had said earlier that you found it more probable, or less probable, that this was a naturalistic accident that was guided. And I hear that a lot, but it baffles me, because when we calculate probability, we have to have some known entity. We have to have some, out of this many tries, this is the explanation this many times. And so far as I can tell, we have no examples of any other universes to compare it to. And we have no examples of how many times a God has in fact caused a universe. So when I'm trying to calculate the probability that God caused a universe, I've either got a 0 in the numerator or the denominator, so I can't calculate a probability. So my answer is, I don't know how probable it is that a God created a universe. I'm not even claiming to know what the origins of the universe are. But until somebody demonstrates that something supernatural exists, that it can cause something, that it is probably the cause of something, I can't even begin to determine whether it's probably the cause of the universe we exist in.
Just a there were a couple more. We are running out of time. We've only got a couple of minutes. We've got hundreds of questions, and I'm sorry we're not going to get through them all. But
No good at short answers.
that's okay. It's been very interesting. A lot of the questions have come up and have been answered in the conversation. But just back to the topic we're thinking about is satisfaction.
Sure.
Can you tell us just why is life more satisfying now? Maybe you can start with you, Matt, and then to Shane.
Sure, yeah. So when this topic was raised, which is more satisfying, I was like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. It's all right. Because I really don't care. I'm more concerned with whether or not something's true than whether or not it's satisfying. The truth may be unsatisfying. This idea to kind of reach out to satisfying, to me, stems from any answer is better than no answer. And not if it's wrong, is my response to that. I'd rather have no answer so that I can keep going out and looking for the answer. And so I'm also kind of the opinion that what we're really talking about isn't satisfaction, but pacification. That by giving answers or apparent answers, it eases our discomfort with not knowing, and that pacifies us, but is it really satisfying? And then the more I thought about the topic, I realized, yeah, I did want to kind of talk about it, because I've said many times I find myself to be generally a better person, but I'm also more satisfied.
So what is it particularly that makes you more satisfied?
Because I'm willing to acknowledge the things that I don't know and keep looking for the right answers. I'm unwilling to accept answers that aren't grounded firmly in reason, evidence. There's a reason why we don't go to the medicine man anymore to find out what's wrong with us. It's because we've learned that medical science is more likely to give us a better answer. Once upon a time, it might have been very satisfying to go to the medicine man and have him say, oh, yes, you've been possessed by an evil spirit, and I'll get rid of that. But if it turns out that you actually had cancer, then the satisfaction was kind of short-lived and not very satisfying ultimately. And I understand people's discomfort with not knowing where the universe came from, or this seems more likely, or I just can't believe that this just happened. And just happened isn't really an accurate description of what happened or what we understand of what happened. And I'm incredibly satisfied by realizing that if there's somebody outside of the universe in charge of guiding my life, I've been intellectually honest and rigorous in trying to find out whether or not this is true. I'm not going to accept it until I have good reason to think that it's true. I'm not going to buy into a fallacy where merely because I can't imagine that this is the case, I'm going to dismiss it and take the magical answer. And as I go through life, I'm incredibly satisfied that the world is getting better in almost every regard, that we are working together and contributing towards this, that my mere disbelief does not make me a monster bent on the destruction of the world, but instead has encouraged me to recognize that I don't think there's going to be an afterlife. If there is, it's a bonus, maybe, which makes this one life that I have very important. And living it correctly and treating people right the first time, as Penn Jillette pointed out once, is about the most satisfying thing I can think of.
Shane, just final words about satisfaction?
I'll start with Penn Jillette. Penn Jillette, he's an atheist, but he's on record as saying he respects people who try to convince him of what they think is ultimate reality, because if it is true, then it really matters. There's a lot of skin in the game. And I respect that we need to be intellectually rigorous, that we need to let the facts lead where they lead. I think we hang too much on science to answer the bigger questions of meaning and purpose sometimes. And if I understand the world beginning in nothing and ending in nothing, then there's really nothing in between. If it's chaotic, then DNA neither knows nor cares, and we dance to the beat. It's rhythm. If we say there is power, whether it's the power of the state or the power of the mob or the power of a deity, I can honestly say it took me longer to come to religious belief, because one of the things that I was railing and pushing against was the deistic view of God as a power who just seems to be impassive. But I came to see that there's a possibility of, and it's reasonable ground in a historical person that God could actually reveal himself as love. That God in himself, the ultimate ground of reality is relationship. And that, to me, was not only logical, it made sense of existence, and it was thoroughly livable, because all of a sudden I had a way of appropriating relationship, a way of appropriating love, a way of understanding why people are so bent towards purpose, and why we find meaningless death so unnerving. And in that context, whilst there's been many aberrations of deistic and theistic belief, at the heart of that for me was a God who is fundamentally relational. And we didn't get to issues of revelation and history, but there
we didn't have 6 hours to kind of talk about it. Yeah. We have actually run out of time, I'm afraid. So please thank Matt and Shane.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.